There is a very specific, hollow kind of silence that rings in your ears when you realize the people who gave you life would rather you didn't exist at all. Or at least, not in the way that makes you you. It doesn't hit you like a slap to the face. It creeps in like carbon monoxide. You don't realize you're suffocating until you're on your knees, staring at the physical manifestation of your soul, years of bled-out paint, twisted wire, charcoal-smudged tears, and desperate, frantic midnight inspiration, and realize it is nothing to them. Less than nothing, it is a nuisance, an eyesore, a temporary placeholder waiting to be wiped clean by people who worship at the altar of quarterly earnings and German luxury cars. They didn't just hate my art. They hated the vulnerability it required. To them, a blank, sterile wall was a triumph of discipline, while my canvases were chaotic failures of a woman who refused to grow up. For 30 years, I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, and more palatable to fit into the sleek, monochromatic box my family built for us. I folded my ambitions into the damp, dark corner of a basement just to avoid staining their pristine, curated reality. But the thing about folding yourself up to appease people who resent your very nature is that eventually, they'll get tired of looking at the creases. They won't just ask you to leave, they'll throw you away. My family's home in the affluent, meticulously manicured suburbs of Connecticut was a monument to their ideology. It was a sprawling, 5,000-square-foot fortress of glass, steel, and unrelenting variations of the color beige. My mother, Evelyn, called it greige. She wielded minimalism not as an aesthetic choice, but as a weapon. Every surface was cleared, polished, and sanitized of human touch. There were no family photos with crooked smiles, no mismatched mugs in the kitchen, no books with cracked spines left on the coffee table. To my mother, evidence of life was evidence of a mess. She spent her days managing the household like a museum curator who despised the patrons, ensuring that our home looked like a spread in Architectural Digest that no one was actually allowed to sit in. My father, Richard, was a managing partner at a private equity firm in Manhattan. He was a man who communicated entirely through the language of return on investment. If a conversation could not be boiled down to a ledger of assets and liabilities, he simply tuned out. He viewed raising children the way he viewed corporate mergers. You pour capital in, you apply strict oversight, and eventually, you extract a lucrative dividend. My brother, Julian, was his crowning achievement, the blue-chip stock that paid out year after year. I, on the other hand, was the bad investment, the sunk cost, the failing subsidiary he kept trying to liquidate. I was 30 years old, unmarried, making just above minimum wage as a gallery assistant downtown, and living in my childhood bedroom. To say I was the black sheep of the family would imply they thought I belonged to their flock in the first place. I was more like a persistent stain on a white silk sofa. The core of my unforgivable sin was my degree. A Bachelor of Fine Arts in Mixed Media and Contemporary Sculpture. An expensive piece of paper that proves you know how to play with glue and garbage. My father called it at my college graduation dinner, right before he refused to pay for my dessert. In their world, value was inherently tied to a price tag, a job title, and a zip code. Because my art didn't generate a six-figure salary, it wasn't a profession. It was a childish delusion that I was stubbornly refusing to outgrow. They didn't understand the physical need I had to create, the way my hands would literally ache if I didn't spend hours blending raw pigments, bending oxidized copper wire, or pouring industrial resin over torn canvas. For me, art wasn't a hobby. It was the only way I knew how to process the cold, transactional reality of my existence. It was my voice in a house where I was perpetually spoken over. Living with them at 30 was a humiliation I swallowed daily, necessitated by the brutal cost of living and the meager scraps of a paycheck I took home from the gallery. I paid them rent, of course. My father insisted on it. Market rate, he had said, drawing up a literal lease agreement on his firm's letterhead when I moved back in after a nasty breakup and a stint of unemployment 2 years prior. I didn't mind paying. I minded the constant, suffocating surveillance. I minded the way my mother would walk past me in the kitchen, look at the permanent smear of phthalo blue under my fingernails, and let out a long, theatrical sigh as if my very presence was exhausting her lungs. The disrespect was a daily routine, woven into the fabric of our interactions. It was never a screaming match, it was death by 1,000 paper cuts. It was my mother, accidentally, throwing away a sketchbook I left on the kitchen island because she thought it was scrap paper. It was my father introducing me to his golf buddies not as his daughter, but as his tenant who is finding herself. But the most agonizing displays of their disdain happened during Evelyn's dinner parties. These parties were high-stakes social combat dressed up as casual Friday night gatherings. The guests were always senior partners, hedge fund managers, and wives whose faces were pulled so tight they looked perpetually surprised. Whenever these events loomed on the calendar, the house would enter a state of martial law. The caterers would arrive, the good crystal was brought out, and I was given my marching orders. Hide. Not me, necessarily, though I was heavily encouraged to make myself scarce, but my work. I remember one specific Friday in late October. The Montgomerys were coming over. Arthur Montgomery owned half the commercial real estate in the tri-state area, and my father was desperately trying to secure his portfolio. I had spent the afternoon in the basement, carefully applying gold leaf to a large, textured piece I was incredibly proud of. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of deep crimsons, jagged pieces of shattered mirror, and thick, impasto acrylics. It was drying on a heavy wooden easel I had built myself. Evelyn marched down the wooden basement stairs, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She didn't knock on the doorframe of my makeshift studio. She never did. "Maya," she snapped, the scent of her expensive, suffocating floral perfume cutting through the smell of turpentine and linseed oil. "The Montgomerys will be here in an hour. Arthur is bringing his new wife. She's on the board of the MoMA." "Okay," I said, carefully wiping a brush on a rag. "I'll stay down here. I have to monitor the drying process anyway so the resin doesn't pool." "I don't care what you monitor," she said, her eyes sweeping over my workspace with undisguised revulsion. "I need you to cover all of this." She waved her manicured hand in a vague, dismissive circle, encompassing hundreds of hours of my blood, sweat, and tears. "Cover it?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Mom, it's in the basement. Beside the furnace. No one is coming down here. Arthur asked for a tour of the house last time, and I am not taking the risk," Evelyn said, her voice dropping an octave into that icy, authoritative tone that meant the conversation was over. "It looks like a junkyard down here. It's embarrassing, Maya. It looks like you're hoarding trash. Get a tarp, put it over the easels, and put those ugly wire things in the storage closet behind the winter coats." "They aren't ugly wire things," I said, my voice shaking slightly. I hated how small I sounded. "They're anatomical studies. They're fragile. If I move them, the joints might snap." Evelyn sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I do not have the patience for your melodrama tonight. You are 30 years old. You are playing arts and crafts in my basement while Julian is out closing a $10 million acquisition. The least you can do is not humiliate us in front of people who actually matter. Cover the clutter, Maya, or I will have the housekeeper throw it out." She turned and walked back up the stairs. I stood there in the dim light, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the shattered mirror embedded in my canvas. My own fragmented reflection stared back at me, looking tired, small, and pathetic. I swallowed the lump of bile in my throat, walked over to the utility shelf, and pulled down a heavy, dirty blue plastic tarp. I draped it over my drying canvas, praying the plastic wouldn't stick to the resin, burying my soul under a layer of polyethylene, just so Arthur Montgomery's third wife wouldn't have to look at it. And then there was Julian. If my parents were the cold, uncaring architects of my misery, my brother Julian was the enthusiastic contractor. Julian was 2 years younger than me, but to look at our family dynamic, you would think he was a Victorian patriarch, and I was a wayward, destitute niece they had taken in out of charity. Julian was a vice president at my father's firm. He was 28, drove a slate-gray Porsche 911, wore bespoke suits that cost more than my car, and had a smile that looked friendly until it reached his eyes, which were as dead and calculating as a shark's. He was the golden child, the undisputed king of the household. When Julian walked into a room, my parents physically gravitated toward him. Their voices softened, their postures relaxed. He was the validation of their entire existence. Julian didn't just disrespect me, He found my existence genuinely amusing. He treated my poverty and my passion as a sitcom running in the background of his highly successful life. He came over for Sunday dinner 2 days after the Montgomery incident. He parked his Porsche diagonally across the driveway, taking up 3 spaces, forcing me to park my beat-up Honda Civic on the street in the pouring rain. When I walked into the house, soaking wet, Julian was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the marble island, swirling a glass of Macallan 18. "Look who it is," Julian smirked as I dripped water onto the hardwood floor. "The next Frida Kahlo. How's the macaroni art business going, Maya? Sell any glued-together popsicle sticks today?" My father chuckled from the dining room, a low, rumbling sound of genuine amusement. My mother handed Julian a napkin so the condensation from his glass wouldn't mark the marble. "I'm an assistant curator, Julian," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor as I took off my soaked boots. "And we actually had a very successful opening last night. A local sculptor sold a piece for—" "Oh, a local sculptor," Julian interrupted, his voice dripping with mock awe. "Well, stop the presses, Wall Street is shaking." "Dad, did you hear that? A local sculptor sold a piece. I guess I should just liquidate my tech portfolio and start investing in clay." "Don't tease your sister, Julian," my father said, walking into the kitchen. He clapped Julian on the shoulder, a gesture of deep, masculine affection he had never once directed at me. "She's just finding her path, even if it's a very, very slow, unprofitable path." "I'm just saying," Julian laughed, taking a sip of his scotch. "I saw a documentary about chimpanzees that can paint. It's a highly competitive market she's in. Got to keep the hustle strong." I didn't say anything. I just picked up my wet boots and walked toward the basement door. I didn't want their food. I didn't want their company. I just wanted my sanctuary. "Hey, Maya," Julian called out just as I put my hand on the doorknob. I paused, not turning around. "I was down there earlier today," he said casually. My blood ran cold. The basement was strictly off-limits to everyone except me. It was the only unspoken boundary in the house. "Why?" I asked, my voice tight. "Just looking around," Julian said. "You've got a lot of junk piled up in that back corner. Old canvases, broken metal. It's starting to smell like a chemical spill." "It's my workspace," I said, gripping the brass doorknob until my knuckles turned white. "It's my studio." "It's a fire hazard," my mother chimed in, walking past me with a tray of roasted asparagus. "Julian is right, it's becoming an absolute eyesore." I didn't wait to hear the rest of the conversation. I opened the door, slipped through, and practically ran down the wooden stairs. The basement was a massive, unfinished space beneath the sprawling footprint of the house. Most of it was dedicated to climate-controlled wine cellars, pristine storage units for my mother's out-of-season designer wardrobes, and the massive HVAC systems that kept the house breathing. But the far southeast corner, tucked behind the hot water heaters and a wall of concrete, was mine. It was my sanctuary, my church, my only piece of sovereign territory in the world. The sensory shift from the upstairs to the downstairs was absolute. Upstairs was the sterile scent of lemon pledge, expensive perfume, and vacuumed carpets. Downstairs smelled of earth, raw canvas, oxidized copper, and the sharp, chemical bite of spray paint and epoxy resin. Upstairs was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator or the CNBC market ticker my father left running on the television. Downstairs was alive with the chaotic energy of creation. I had spent 5 years slowly building this space. My father had given me the corner with extreme reluctance, only after I pointed out that renting an external studio would mean I couldn't afford his arbitrary, market-rate, rent. I had scavenged discarded workbenches from an old high school that was being demolished. I had bought heavy-duty shelving units from hardware stores and assembled them myself, blistering my hands with the cheap wrenches. And the art. God, the art, it was everywhere. Leaning against the cold concrete walls were dozens of large-scale canvases. My style was aggressive, emotional, and deeply textural. I didn't just paint, I built. I layered acrylics with plaster, embedding objects into the canvas, shattered glass, rusted gears, pages torn from old ledgers, a silent rebellion against my father's worldview, and tangled knots of copper wire. In the center of the space stood my masterpiece. It was a massive, overarching project I had been working on for 3 solid years. It wasn't just one piece. It was a cohesive portfolio, a collection of 30 intertwined sculptures and canvases that explored the theme of suffocation and the weight of familial expectation. The crown jewel of the collection was a life-sized, hollow silhouette of a woman, constructed entirely out of heavy, rusted iron chains and delicate, translucent resin. It was a study in contradictions, the unbreakable, suffocating weight of the chains forming the rigid boundary of the body, while the fragile, glass-like resin filled the empty space inside, catching the dim basement light and refracting it into 1,000 fractured rainbows. I had spent countless nights awake until dawn, meticulously welding the chains link by link, wearing a heavy mask to protect my lungs from the fumes, sweating through my clothes, burning my forearms with stray sparks. It was the most beautiful, honest thing I had ever created. I called the entire collection the clutter, a dark, sarcastic nod to my mother's favorite word for my soul. My plan was to finally photograph the entire collection next month, bind it into a professional portfolio, and submit it to the top 3 contemporary galleries in Manhattan. It was my ticket out. It was my proof of life. I walked over to the iron and resin sculpture and ran a trembling hand over the cold, rough chains. My heart was still racing from Julian's comment. I was down there earlier today. The thought of his expensive leather shoes stepping onto my drop cloths, his condescending, shark-like eyes scanning my most intimate vulnerabilities, made me feel physically ill. He didn't see the hours of labor. He didn't see the emotional exorcism taking place on the canvas. He just saw trash. He saw macaroni art. I spent the rest of the evening down there, unable to paint. I just sat on a paint-splattered milk crate, staring at my work, trying to calm the dark, swirling knot of anxiety in my stomach. I told myself I was being paranoid. They hated my art, yes, but it was out of sight. As long as I kept it in the basement, as long as I paid my rent and absorbed their insults with a bowed head, they would leave me my corner. They had to. It was the silent treaty we had established. But the tension in the house began to shift over the next few weeks. It was subtle at first, a change in the atmospheric pressure. It started with the magazines. I would come home from the gallery, exhausted, smelling of packing peanuts and archival tape, and find glossy catalogs for elite home gym equipment spread out on the kitchen island. Rogue Fitness, Peloton, Tonal, pictures of sleek, matte black squat racks and chrome dumbbells. Then came the casual comments dropped during breakfast. My trainer says I need to start doing Olympic lifts, Julian said one Tuesday morning, pouring a protein shake into a shaker bottle. CrossFit is the only way to build real functional mass, but the gym downtown is getting too crowded with amateurs. I can't get a rack when I need one. You work too hard to wait in line, Julian, my father agreed, not looking up from his iPad. You should just build a setup here. We have the space. That's what I was thinking, Julian said. I froze, my spoon hovering over my bowl of cheap oatmeal. I just need a space with high ceilings and a concrete subfloor. You can't drop 300 pounds of iron on hardwood. My mother smiled, sipping her black coffee. I think a home gym is a wonderful idea, sweetheart. It adds value to the property. Where were you thinking of putting it? Julian slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. His smile was razor-thin. The basement. The southeast corner has the best clearance for a lifting platform. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Julian, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, that's my studio. Julian rolled his eyes, a dramatic theatrical sigh escaping his lips. Maya, be reasonable. You're taking up, what, 400 square feet of prime real estate for a hobby? You're playing with finger paints. I'm trying to maintain my physical health to perform at an executive level. It's a matter of prioritization. I pay rent, I said, my voice shaking. I looked at my father, desperate for the man of ledgers and contracts to honor our agreement. Dad, we signed a lease. That space is mine. My father finally looked up from his iPad. His eyes were flat, devoid of any paternal warmth. He looked at me the way he looked at a failing startup he was about to gut and sell for parts. You pay a subsidized rate, Maya, my father said coldly, and a lease can be amended when the needs of the property owner change. Julian is offering to invest his own capital into improving the house. You are using the space to hoard whatever it is you do down there. It's my life's work, I pleaded, the panic rising in my throat, hot and sharp. I'm submitting it to galleries next month. I just need a little more time. Please. Oh, for God's sake, Maya, stop with the dramatics, my mother snapped, slamming her coffee cup down on the marble counter. It is a pile of junk. It attracts spiders. The house smells like a chemical plant. Julian needs the space for something productive. You need to start clearing it out this weekend. I can't, I breathed. I can't move it. The resin piece alone weighs 200 pounds. If I move it before I photograph it, it could shatter. Then throw it away. Julian laughed, walking over and patting me condescendingly on the top of my head. I flinched away from his touch. Take a picture of it on your iPhone and toss it in a dumpster. Nobody cares, Maya. It's not real art, it's clutter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a 9-figure merger to negotiate. I spent the entirety of my Thursday shift at the gallery in a state of manic, desperate calculation. I hid in the archival room behind stacks of bubble wrap, furiously scrolling through storage unit rentals on my phone. The numbers were grim. First month's rent, a security deposit, the cost of renting a U-Haul, the price of heavy-duty moving blankets, packing tape, and ratchet straps. It was going to wipe out my savings entirely. But it didn't matter. I would eat ramen for a month. I would walk to work. I mentally measured the dimensions of the iron and resin sculpture, visualizing exactly how I would tilt it to navigate the narrow stairwell of the basement. I had a plan. By Saturday morning, my soul would be boxed up, safely locked behind a corrugated steel door across town, and Julian could have his concrete altar to his own vanity. I just had to survive Thursday night. The sky had bruised into a deep, violently purple twilight by the time I left the gallery. The temperature had dropped sharply, and a freezing, torrential rain began to fall, turning the Manhattan gridlock into a sea of red taillights and blaring horns. The drive back to Connecticut, usually an hour and change, stretched into an agonizing 2.5-hour crawl. The rhythm of the windshield wipers felt like a countdown clock ticking away in my skull. When I finally turned onto the pristine, tree-lined street of my family's subdivision, the rain was coming down in sheets, washing across the asphalt in thick, shimmering rivers. I squinted through the deluge, the headlights of my Civic sweeping across the manicured lawns. I hit the brakes. My car skidded slightly on the wet pavement, the tires hissing as I came to a dead stop in the middle of the street. Parked in our wide, paver-stone driveway was not Julian's slate-gray Porsche. It was a monolithic, rusted green roll-off dumpster, the kind they use for industrial demolition sites. It was massive, spanning the length of 2 cars, its metal sides scarred and dented. It sat there like an open grave in front of the house. I didn't turn the car off. I didn't even put it in park. I just shoved the gearshift into neutral, yanked the parking brake, and threw the door open. The rain hit me instantly, an icy shock that soaked through my thin wool coat in seconds. I left the car door hanging wide open, the ding-ding-ding of the key ignition echoing out into the storm. I walked up the driveway, my boots splashing heavily into deep puddles. My chest felt hollowed out, scooped clean by a jagged, rusted spoon. I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, too cold. As I approached the hulking green metal box, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of household garbage. It was the sharp, unmistakable scent of turpentine, shattered drywall, and crushed resin. I grabbed the slippery, wet rim of the dumpster and pulled myself up, scraping the skin off my palms on the rusted metal, desperate to see inside. What I saw will be burned into the retinas of my eyes until the day I die. There was no careful packing. There was no disassembling. It was a slaughterhouse of my own creation. My massive, carefully stretched canvases had been thrown in first, their wooden frames snapped like twigs under the weight of the debris piled on top of them. The deep crimsons and impasto acrylics I had painstakingly layered for months were now smeared with mud and wet cardboard. And there, resting in the center of the wreckage like a desecrated corpse, was the clutter. My masterpiece. The iron and resin silhouette that had cost me 3 years of burnt hands and sleepless nights. It had not survived the trip up the stairs. Someone, Julian, or whatever demolition crew he had hired, had taken a sledgehammer to it. The heavy iron chains I had welded link by link were twisted and violently bent. The delicate, translucent resin that filled the core of the silhouette had been shattered into 1,000 jagged, cloudy shards, now pooling with dirty rainwater at the bottom of the rusted container. The hollow head of the sculpture was severed, lying face down in a pile of rotting lawn clippings and an empty protein powder tub. The rain beat down relentlessly, washing the gold leaf off a shattered mirror I had embedded in a smaller piece. The gold flakes swirled in the dark water before slipping down the drain holes at the bottom of the dumpster. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My body simply shut down. I slid down the cold, wet metal side of the dumpster and fell to my knees on the driveway. The freezing rain plastered my hair to my face, running down my cheeks like the tears I couldn't form. I stared at a piece of splintered wood resting near my boot, the corner of the easel I had built with my own hands. I touched it. It was real. This was real. They had murdered it. They had looked at the physical manifestation of my heart, deemed it an inconvenience, and paid men in work boots to smash it to pieces and throw it in the rain. I don't know how long I knelt there in the storm. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been an hour. Eventually, the front door of the house opened. The warm, golden light of the foyer spilled out onto the wet driveway. "Maya, is that you?" My father's voice called out, annoyed. "What on earth are you doing?" "Shut your car door. The alarm is going to wake the neighbors." I slowly stood up. My coat weighed 50 pounds, soaked completely through with freezing rain. My hands were bleeding, covered in rust and grease from the dumpster. I turned and walked toward the house. I walked up the stone steps, past my father, ignoring his exasperated sighs, and stepped into the pristine, climate-controlled foyer. I dripped dirty rainwater and mud onto the imported Italian marble. My mother walked out of the formal dining room, a linen napkin clutched in her hand. Julian followed close behind her, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Oh my God, Maya, look at the floor!" Evelyn shrieked, rushing forward, her eyes wide with horror, not at my bleeding hands or my drowned appearance, but at the puddle of water forming around my boots. "You're ruining the stone. Get on the mat." I didn't move. I looked at Julian. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, holding a glass of sparkling water. He looked incredibly relaxed. "What did you do?" My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Raspy. Dead. Julian chuckled, taking a sip of his water. "I did you a favor, Maya. I knew you were going to drag your feet and turn this whole thing into a massive, melodramatic production. Moving all that garbage would have taken you weeks, so I called a junk removal service. They knocked it out in 2 hours. You're welcome." "You destroyed it," I whispered, the words barely making it past my lips. "You took a sledgehammer to my work." "It wouldn't fit around the bend in the stairwell," Julian said with a casual shrug, completely devoid of empathy. "The guys had to break it down. It's not a big deal. The basement is completely cleared out now. The epoxy floor goes in on Monday, the racks arrive on Wednesday." I looked at my parents. They were standing there, watching this unfold. They weren't stepping in. They weren't horrified. My father was looking at his watch. "Dad," I said, a final, pathetic plea for humanity escaping my chest. "They smashed it. 3 years of my work, everything I had." My father sighed, the heavy, burdened sigh of a man dealing with a hysterical child. "Maya, we talked about this morning. Julian needed the space. We gave you ample warning." "You gave me 12 hours. I screamed, the sound finally tearing itself out of my throat, raw and jagged. It was the loudest I had ever spoken in that house. The sheer force of it made my mother flinch backward. It was my art. It was my portfolio. It was everything I am. "It was trash," my mother snapped back, her patience evaporating, the icy cruelty finally dropping its polite veneer. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "It was an embarrassment, Maya. We let you play in the dirt down there for years because we pitied you. But enough is enough. It was just worthless clutter anyway. It is time you grew up, took a shower, and got a real job." Silence fell over the foyer. The only sound was the rain hammering against the massive glass doors behind me. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at Julian. I waited for the anger to consume me. I waited for the urge to lunge forward, to claw at Julian's cashmere sweater, to smash the expensive vases lining the hallway, to tear their perfect, sterile house apart piece by piece. But the anger never came. Instead, a profound, glacial stillness washed over me. The suffocating carbon monoxide of their presence finally cleared. I saw them not as my family, but as exactly what they were. Empty, transactional creatures who worship the superficial and despise the authentic. They couldn't be reasoned with, they couldn't be hurt, they couldn't be loved. Something deep inside the core of my chest snapped. It wasn't a clean break. It was the severing of the final, rotting thread that tied me to this house. Okay, I said quietly. My mother blinked, caught off guard by the sudden drop in volume. Okay, well, good. Now go around back, take off those boots, and use the mudroom entrance. I didn't go to the mudroom. I turned around, my wet boots squeaking on the marble, and walked up the grand staircase. Maya. The carpets, Evelyn yelled after me. I ignored her. I walked into my childhood bedroom, a space completely devoid of my personality, decorated by my mother in shades of beige and cream. I walked to the closet and pulled down a large canvas duffel bag. I didn't pack anything sentimental. I didn't pack the photo albums. I packed underwear, heavy sweaters, jeans, my laptop, my sketchbed, my brushes, and my set of professional palette knives. I went into the bathroom, grabbed my toiletries, and threw them in on top. I zipped the bag shut. It weighed almost nothing. 30 years of a life, condensed into a single piece of carry-on luggage. I walked back down the stairs. The three of them were still in the foyer, a housekeeper now hurriedly mopping the puddles I had left behind. They watched me descend, their faces blank masks of confusion. "Where do you think you're going?" my father demanded, stepping forward, his authoritative tone kicking in. "You're throwing a tantrum. It's pouring rain. Put the bag down." I walked right past him. I didn't look at him. I pushed the heavy front door open, stepping back out into the freezing storm. "Maya," Julian called out, his voice tinged with a sudden, faint edge of uncertainty. "You don't have anywhere to go. You're broke." I slammed the door behind me, cutting off his voice. I walked down the driveway, past the rusted green dumpster, holding the shattered remains of the girl I used to be. I got into my idling car, the heater blasting warm air against my frozen skin. I pulled my phone out of my wet pocket. I opened my contacts. Dad blocked, Mom blocked, Julian blocked. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, shifted the car into drive, and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove into the black, stormy night, leaving the shell of Maya behind in the rain. The first year was a blur of starvation and concrete. I moved into a 200-square-foot, unheated studio apartment in a decaying industrial building in Bushwick. It had a hot plate, a mattress on the floor, and a massive, reinforced concrete floor that could withstand anything. I legally changed my name. I stripped away their surname, their legacy, the very identity they had tried to mold into a corporate drone. Maya was dead. She died in a dumpster in Connecticut. The woman who replaced her was entirely different. She was forged in the fire of absolute, uncompromising spite. I quit the gallery. I worked grueling, cash-under-the-table night shifts as a bartender in a dive bar, dealing with drunks and cleaning up vomit, just to keep my days entirely free. And during those days, I built. The grief of losing the clutter eventually morphed into a furious, unrelenting obsession. Without the suffocating presence of my family, without the constant fear of my mother's sighs or Julian's mockery, the floodgates opened. My art became darker, heavier, infinitely more complex. I stopped using cheap acrylics and started working with industrial chemicals, molten metals, and salvaged architectural ruins. I refused to show my face. I refused to let my gender, my age, or my background be a factor in how my work was consumed. I created a pseudonym, an empty vessel. I submitted my first piece to an underground, highly exclusive pop-up show in a Brooklyn warehouse. I didn't attend the opening. I sent a courier to deliver the piece, a violent, beautiful explosion of shattered safety glass and burnt, oxidized copper woven through the frame of a rusted car door. I priced it at $10,000, an absurd sum for an unknown artist. It sold in 20 minutes. The buyer was an eccentric European collector who was captivated by the sheer, unbridled rage of the piece. Word began to spread. The mystery of V became a virus in the contemporary art world. Who was this person creating these massive, brutalist masterpieces? A disgruntled architect? A former steelworker? A reclusive genius? I fueled the fire. I signed strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreements with Elias, a ruthlessly brilliant, bespoke gallerist in Chelsea who became my sole point of contact with the outside world. Elias was the only person who knew who I was, and he understood the power of the myth. He handled the logistics, I handled the creation. Year 2, a piece sold for 50,000. Year 3, a solo exhibition in Paris sold out in an hour, netting over $500,000. Year 4, the Museum of Modern Art acquired a permanent installation of mine, cementing V into the bedrock of art history. By year 5, I was a ghost who possessed the world. I moved out of the freezing Bushwick box and into a massive, 10,000 square foot penthouse loft in Tribeca. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, pristine white gallery walls, and a private freight elevator. I wore clothes that cost more than Julian's Porsche, not because I cared about the labels, but because the fabric felt good against my skin while I worked. I had assistants who cleaned my brushes, accountants who managed my trust, and a bank account that looked like a telephone number. I had one. I had taken their definition of worthless and spun it into gold. I was the hottest, most fiercely debated, and most expensive contemporary artist on the planet. And yet, beneath the silk shirts and the millions, the core of my drive remained untouched. The hollow silence I felt that night in the driveway had never truly left me. I had simply weaponized it. It was late Tuesday afternoon in November, exactly 5 years to the week since the destruction of my portfolio. I was in the center of my studio, wearing a pair of paint-splattered coveralls, using a blowtorch to melt the edges of a massive sheet of industrial plexiglass. The blue flame hissed against the plastic, filling the air with the familiar, acrid smell of creation. My phone rang, echoing off the high ceilings. It was a private, encrypted line. Only one person had the number. I shut off the torch, flipped up my welding mask, and picked up the receiver. "Elias," I said, wiping a streak of soot off my forehead with the back of my hand. "Tell me you secured the new resins." "I secured the resins, V," Elias' smooth, cultured voice purred through the speaker. "But that is not why I am calling. I am calling because the auction house just sent over the preliminary bidder profiles for the winter gala at Sotheby's. Sotheby's was hosting a massive, invite-only white-glove auction in 2 weeks. It was the social event of the decade. The centerpiece of the entire evening was the grand unveiling and sale of my newest, highly anticipated masterpiece. I hadn't let anyone see it yet. Even Elias had only seen sketches. "And," I asked, walking over to the mini-fridge to grab a bottle of water, "is the Saudi prince still trying to outbid the tech billionaire?" "They are both in the pool," Elias said, a distinct edge of amusement in his voice. "But there is a new syndicate that just registered. A small, desperate cluster of aggressive new money buyers from the tri-state area. They just liquidated a terrifying amount of equity and pulled high-interest margin loans just to meet the deposit requirements to enter the bidding floor. They are highly motivated, desperate even, to acquire your piece to secure their social standing." I stopped unscrewing the cap of my water bottle. A cold, electric prickle walked down my spine. "Who is it, Elias?" I heard the rustle of paper on the other end of the line. "The lead bidder is a private equity managing partner named Richard," Elias read slowly, deliberately. "Backed heavily by a VP at his firm, a man named Julian. They are putting everything on the line for this, they are mortgaging their own firm." The water bottle slipped from my hand, hitting the concrete floor with a heavy thud, water spilling out in a dark, spreading pool. My family, they didn't know it was me. They had no idea. They were just chasing the ghost of V, desperately clawing for the ultimate status symbol, completely unaware that the god they were praying to was the daughter they had thrown in the garbage. I looked across the massive expanse of my studio. Standing under a massive white silk drop cloth, illuminated by the fading afternoon sun, was my newest piece. The piece going to the auction. It was finished. I hadn't told Elias what it was. I hadn't told anyone. I slowly walked over to the drop cloth and gripped the edge of the silk. "Elias," I whispered, my voice trembling with a dark, terrifying euphoria, "confirm their registration. Give them front row seats." I gripped the edge of the cool white silk and pulled. The heavy fabric whispered as it slid off the towering mass in the center of my studio, collapsing into a pool of white at my boots. There it was. My Trojan horse. For the last 8 months, I had worked on this piece with a manic, obsessive frenzy that terrified even me. I had not told Elias what the subject matter was. I had locked the doors to my studio, covered the windows, and worked in complete isolation. When the prestigious auction house begged for a title for their glossy, leather-bound catalogs, I gave them a single word: Genesis. But that was a lie. The real title, the one etched into my own heart, was Clutter Reborn. It was a perfect, one, agonizingly precise recreation of the exact pile of garbage my family had left to rot in the rusted green dumpster 5 years ago. I had used my photographic memory, referencing the nightmares that still occasionally woke me up in cold sweats, to reconstruct the slaughterhouse of my youth. But this time, I didn't use cheap canvas, fragile wood, or brittle resin. I used the language of the ultra-wealthy. The broken, splintered frame of my old easel was meticulously cast in solid, oxidized bronze. The shattered, jagged shards of what used to be the translucent resin of my silhouette were recreated using flawless, custom-cut optical crystal that caught the studio lights and refracted them into blinding prisms. The torn, muddy canvases that had been soaked by the rain were immortalized in heavy, hand-tooled leather. The smeared paint replicated using crushed lapis lazuli, pure gold leaf, and rare earth pigments. And at the center, the severed, dented head of the iron silhouette lay perfectly tilted, exactly as it had rested in the rot of the dumpster. But the twisted chains were now forged from aerospace-grade titanium, anodized to a deep, bruised violet. It was breathtaking. It was a monument to destruction, elevated to a level of absurd, opulent luxury. It was a mirror held up to the face of consumerist greed, a joke only I understood. And now, my family, the very people who had wielded the sledgehammer, were mortgaging their lives to buy it. I began to laugh. It started as a low, breathless sound in my chest and erupted into a hollow, echoing sound that bounced off the concrete walls of my empty penthouse. I couldn't stop. I laughed until my vision blurred, until my ribs ached, leaning heavily against my work table to keep from collapsing. Elia's voice buzzed with concern through the encrypted phone lines still resting on the table. Are you still there? Are you all right? I picked up the phone, wiping a stray tear of pure, malicious joy from the corner of my eye. I'm perfectly fine, Elias. Tell me everything you know about this syndicate. Why are Richard and Julian buying contemporary art? They despise it. They think it's a tax write-off for degenerates. Status, Elias replied simply, the keyboard clacking on his end as he pulled up the dossier. According to the financial whispers I'm monitoring, Richard's private equity firm has been bleeding capital for the last 3 quarters. He is desperately trying to secure a massive buyout from a group of old-money European investors. But these investors are traditional, cultured. They view Richard and his son as crude, unrefined finance bros, nouveau rich scavengers. So they need a cultural anchor, I murmured, staring at the crystalline shards of my ruined soul. They need to prove they belong in the club. Exactly, Elias said. And nothing screams, I belong in the upper echelon of human society, quite like dropping millions on the newest, highly secretive masterpiece by the world's most reclusive genius. It is a pure ego play, a peacock flashing its feathers to attract a mate with a much larger bank account. But they do not have the liquid capital for this. Explain, I said, my voice hardening into ice. Sotheby's requires proof of funds for a piece estimated in the 7 figures, Elias detailed, his tone turning clinical and precise. Julian and Richard have essentially leveraged their entire existence to meet the threshold. Julian took out a massive second mortgage on his condo in Tribeca and liquidated his entire tech portfolio. Richard borrowed heavily against the firm's assets, taking out brutal, high-interest margin loans. They even drained the equity out of their primary residence in Connecticut. They were betting the house. They were betting the firm. They were taking the very foundation of the life they had prized over my existence, the sterile beige fortress they had guarded so jealously, and putting it all on red. Elias, I said, a dark, cold smile spreading across my face, do not let the auction house restrict their bidding limit. If they want to hang themselves, I want to make sure they have enough rope to reach the floor. Consider it done, Elias said, a hint of reverence in his voice. The gala is in 12 days. The next 12 days passed in a state of suspended animation. The art world was in a frenzy. The glossy catalogs were mailed out to the global elite, featuring heavily shadowed, obscure macro photographs of my piece. The mystery fueled the hysteria. Speculation about the pieces' meaning dominated high society blogs and art columns. Then came the night of the auction. I did not attend. The thought of breathing the same air as them, of smelling my mother's suffocating floral perfume, or seeing the arrogant slant of Julian's jaw in person, was too much of a risk to my composure. Instead, I arranged for a secure, private live feed of the auction floor to be broadcast directly to my studio's massive 90-inch monitor. I sat in a plush leather armchair in the dark, a single glass of exceptionally expensive Cabernet in my hand, watching the high-definition feed. The main bidding room at Sotheby's looked like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of capital. Heavy velvet drapes, dramatic spotlights, and rows of pristine mahogany chairs were filled with billionaires, oligarchs, and the cultural elite. It smelled, even through the screen, of Tom Ford cologne, dry champagne, and ruthless ambition. The camera panned across the crowd, and my heart slammed against my ribs. There they were. Row 4, center aisle. I hadn't seen them in 5 years. The shock of their physical reality was jarring. My father looked older, the stress of his failing firm etching deep, bitter lines into his face. His hair had thinned, and he kept aggressively checking his watch. My mother sat beside him, wearing an emerald green Oscar de la Renta gown that I knew for a fact cost more than my entire college tuition. She looked tense, her eyes darting around the room, desperately trying to make eye contact with people who were actively ignoring her. And then there was Julian. He was sitting on the edge of his seat, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, holding a numbered bidding paddle like it was a weapon. He looked exactly the same. The same smug aura, the same shark-like eyes, the same desperate need to be the most important person in the room. He was leaning over, whispering furiously to my father, pointing at the auctioneer's podium. They looked out of place. They looked desperate. It was beautiful. The auction progressed through several lesser pieces, a minor Picasso sketch, a Warhol screenprint, until the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. The auctioneer, a distinguished British man with a voice like a silver bell, stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, the room instantly falling into a dead, electric silence. "The centerpiece of our winter gala, Lot 42, a brand new, never-before-seen mixed-media installation by the anonymous contemporary master known only as V, titled Genesis." The massive black velvet curtains at the front of the room parted. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. It was audible through the speakers. Even the camera operator seemed to flinch, zooming in on the bronze, crystal, and titanium wreckage. Under the dramatic gallery lighting, the piece looked terrifying and majestic. The crystalline shards of resin threw fractured rainbows across the faces of the billionaires in the front row. It was a violent, chaotic mess, frozen in time and cast in precious metals. I watched my family's reaction closely. Julian stared at it, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He leaned over to my father. I could read his lips perfectly. "What is it?" "It looks like a pile of scrap metal." My father shook his head, his face pale. "It doesn't matter what it is," he mouthed back. "Look at the Saudis. They want it." "This piece," the auctioneer continued, his voice ringing with authority, "is a profound exploration of destruction and rebirth, a staggering achievement in material juxtaposition. Bidding will commence at $1 million. The room erupted. "1 million, the gentleman on the aisle," the auctioneer rattled off smoothly. 1.1, the phone bank. 1.2 to the lady in the balcony. 1.3. Julian didn't move immediately. He was sweating. I could see the sheen of moisture on his forehead under the bright lights. He was waiting, playing the game. Let the small fish burn themselves out. The bidding climbed rapidly, aggressively. 1.5. 1.6. The room began to thin out. It was down to 3 bidders. A representative for a tech billionaire in Silicon Valley on the phones, a notoriously aggressive European heiress in the front row, and Julian. 1.7 million, the phone bank, the auctioneer called. Julian's hand shot up. His paddle, number 142, sliced through the air. 1.8 million, paddle 142. The auctioneer nodded toward Julian. My father grabbed Julian's arm, his face contorted in panic. I could see the argument unfolding in real time. My father was terrified. They had hit their ceiling. The margin loans were tapped out. The house was leveraged. The heiress in the front row elegantly raised a single, diamond-encrusted finger. 1.9 million, the auctioneer said smoothly. To the lady in the front. Julian looked at the heiress. She didn't even glance at him. She looked utterly bored, dismissing him entirely. I saw the exact moment Julian's ego overrode his survival instinct. The vein in his neck bulged. He couldn't lose to her. He couldn't be the uncultured finance bro who got outbid in front of the entire New York elite. He shook off my father's grip violently. Julian stood up, thrusting his paddle into the air. $2 million, Julian shouted, his voice echoing across the silent room. It was against auction etiquette to yell out a bid, a gauche display of desperation that caused several people in the crowd to wince. The room fell dead silent. The auctioneer looked at the heiress. She sighed delicately, gave a small, dismissive shake of her head, and looked down at her program. The auctioneer scanned the room. $2 million, going once. My father looked like he was going to vomit. He was gripping the mahogany arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. My mother was smiling a rigid, terrified smile, clapping her hands silently, trying to project triumph while her eyes screamed in panic. Going twice, the auctioneer called out, raising the polished wooden gavel. I leaned forward in the dark of my studio, my heart hammering against my ribs, the wine glass forgotten in my hand. Bring it down, I whispered to the screen. Bring the hammer down. Sold, the auctioneer boomed, slamming the gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack. For $2 million to paddle 142. Applause broke out across the room, polite and reserved. Julian slumped back into his chair, his chest heaving, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked like a man who had just won a game of Russian roulette. He had won the prize, but the realization of what it had cost was rapidly settling in. I fell back into my chair, the breath rushing out of my lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. The trap was sprung. The jaws had snapped shut. They had just spent $2 million, money they did not have, borrowed at ruinous interest rates against every asset they owned, to buy the exact same pile of garbage they had forced me to throw into a dumpster. 2 days later, Elias called me. The funds have cleared, Elias said, his voice tinged with a dark amusement. The syndicate wired the full amount this morning. I had to verify the routing numbers 3 times. It was a chaotic mix of liquidated retirement accounts, leveraged firm capital, and deeply subprime personal loans. They are entirely hollowed out. And the piece? I asked, looking out over the glittering Manhattan skyline from my window. Delivered and installed yesterday afternoon, Elias confirmed. And you will appreciate this. They didn't put it in a private gallery or a secure vault. They put it in the center of their grand foyer, right inside the front door. They are hosting a massive, catered unveiling party this Saturday for all the European investors and the local high society. I closed my eyes, savoring the poetic justice. They put it in the foyer, the exact place where my mother had screamed at me for ruining her marble floors, the exact place where they had called my life's work a worthless embarrassment. They had placed the ghost of my destroyed soul on a pedestal in the center of their home, worshipping it like a golden calf. Elias, I said softly, opening my eyes, is the magazine feature finalized? The editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair called me an hour ago, Elias replied. The cover story is printed, the digital spread is locked. The exclusive television interview we pre-recorded is queued up. The entire art world knows, is finally dropping her anonymity this Saturday evening at 8 o'clock sharp. Saturday evening? Right in the middle of their lavish, self-congratulatory party. Excellent, I breathed, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of peace wash over me. Let them enjoy their victory for a few days, Elias. Let them brag. Let them tell the world how cultured they are. I walked over to the blank canvas waiting on my easel, picking up a heavy palette knife coated in deep, crimson paint. Because on Saturday night, I whispered into the phone, I am going to burn their entire world to the ground. Saturday evening in Manhattan arrived with a crystalline, biting chill, the kind of winter night that makes the city skyline look like it was carved from diamonds and black ice. Inside my Tribeca penthouse, the atmosphere was a study in absolute tranquility. The air smelled faintly of lavender and oil paint. I was dressed in a simple, loose-fitting black silk blouse and tailored trousers, barefoot on the heated oak floors. I didn't feel the nervous, vibrating energy I used to feel before a gallery opening. I didn't feel the sickening churn of anxiety that used to define my existence when I lived under my parents' roof. I felt entirely, profoundly weightless. At 7:30, the private elevator chimed, and its heavy steel doors slid open to reveal Elias. He stepped into the loft holding a bottle of Dom Perignon vintage champagne in one hand and a sleek, encrypted tablet in the other. He was dressed immaculately, as always in a bespoke navy suit, but there was a rare, almost predatory gleam in his dark eyes tonight. "The stage is set, V," Elias said, walking over to the massive island in my kitchen and setting the bottle down. He didn't bother with glasses. He knew tonight wasn't about polite celebration, it was about the raw, unfiltered consumption of vengeance. "Did you get the feed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart executing a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. "Of course I did," Elias purred, tapping the screen of his tablet. When Richard's assistant hired the premier audio-visual company in the tri-state area to set up a massive, 80-inch screening monitor in their formal living room, I simply ensured that the lead technician was a man who is heavily subsidized by my gallery. He installed a discreet, wide-angle, high-definition lens directly into the bezel of the television itself, wired right into their home network. We have a perfect, unobstructed view of the room. Elias synced his tablet to the massive 90-inch monitor, mounted on my own studio wall. The screen flickered black for a fraction of a second, and then, like a portal ripping open through time and space, I was looking into the heart of my past. The formal living room of my childhood home in Connecticut was bathed in the warm, golden glow of recessed lighting and crystal chandeliers. The room was packed. It was a suffocating sea of designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, and faces pulled tight by surgical intervention and generational wealth. I immediately recognized the heavy hitters of their social circle. Arthur Montgomery was there, holding a tumbler of scotch, his MoMA board member wife clinging to his arm. There were European investors, hedge fund managers, and local politicians, all mingling in a cloud of expensive perfume and hollow laughter. And there, standing in the center of the adjoining foyer, visible through the wide archway, was Genesis. It looked colossal in that space. The violent, rusted bronze frame, the bruised titanium chains, the shattered, prismatic optical crystal, it commanded the room like a dark deity. The track lighting my mother had installed specifically to highlight the piece caught the fractured edges of the crystal, throwing scattered, chaotic rainbows against the pristine, beige walls. I found them in the crowd. My mother, Evelyn, was holding court near the grand piano. She was wearing a floor-length silver gown, a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She was positively vibrating with smug satisfaction, pointing elegantly toward the sculpture as a circle of wealthy wives nodded in awed, ignorant agreement. My father, Richard, was standing with a group of stern-faced European men. He was sweating slightly, a tight, forced smile plastered on his face as he gestured broadly toward the art. He was playing the part of the cultured Renaissance man, a titan of industry who also understood the delicate nuances of contemporary brilliance. He was quite literally pitching his own refinement to save his sinking firm. But it was Julian who made my stomach turn. He was standing directly in front of the piece, flanked by two younger, highly attractive women and a rival vice president from his firm. He held a glass of champagne, using his free hand to trace the air inches from the twisted titanium chains, explaining the meaning of the work. He was waxing poetic about the juxtaposition of form and chaos, using buzzwords he had clearly memorized from the Sotheby's catalog. He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He looked invincible. "Look at them," Elias murmured, stepping up beside me, his eyes fixed on the screen. "They are gorging themselves on the prestige of your ghost. They have no idea what they are actually looking at." "They will in 5 minutes," I said, glancing at the digital clock on my wall. 7:55 p.m. In the Connecticut living room, a hired butler softly chimed a crystal bell, drawing the attention of the crowd. My father stepped into the center of the room, raising his glass. The audio feed picked up his voice, clear and booming. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and friends," Richard began, his chest puffed out, radiating an unearned authority. "Evelyn, Julian, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight in our home. As you know, our family has always held a deep, profound appreciation for the fine arts. We believe that true wealth is not just found in portfolios, but in culture. In the bold, the provocative, and the visionary." He paused to let a polite ripple of applause wash over him. "Tonight is a historic night in the art world," he continued, gesturing toward the massive screen that had been set up in the corner of the room. "The brilliant mind behind our newest acquisition, the enigmatic genius known only as V, has finally chosen to reveal her identity to the world in an exclusive broadcast. We thought it only fitting to witness this momentous occasion surrounded by the piece itself, surrounded by all of you. So, please, refresh your glasses. The broadcast begins momentarily." The crowd murmured in excited anticipation. They all turned toward the blank screen. At exactly 8 o'clock, the feed from the news network kicked in. The logo for a premier high society investigative program flashed across the screen, followed by the dramatic, orchestral swell of their intro music. The camera cut to the veteran journalist, a woman known for her piercing, highly coveted interviews. For 5 years, the journalist began, her voice grave and captivating, "The contemporary art world has been dominated by a ghost. A single letter. V. Her massive, industrial masterpieces have shattered auction records, captured the imaginations of critics globally, and redefined the modern aesthetic. Yet, her identity has remained the most fiercely guarded secret in the industry. Until tonight." In the living room in Connecticut, you could hear a pin drop. Julian took a slow sip of his champagne, his eyes glued to the screen. My mother rested her hand on my father's arm, beaming. The camera angle on the broadcast shifted. It cut to the pre-recorded interview we had shot 3 days prior in Elia's Chelsea gallery. The lighting was stark, cinematic, and moody. The shot opened on my hands. My hands, still bearing the faint, permanent calluses from welding iron chains and the microscopic scars from shattered resin. The camera slowly panned up the dark sleeves of my tailored suit, settling finally on my face. I looked directly into the lens. My expression was perfectly calm, an ocean of ice. The host leaned forward. "Let's start with the question the entire world has been asking. Who is V?" On my 90-inch monitor, I watched the live feed of my family's living room. On the broadcast, I took a slow breath. "My name," I said, my voice resonating with absolute, unapologetic clarity, "is Maya." It happened in agonizingly beautiful slow motion. In the Connecticut living room, the color simply drained out of Evelyn's face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin left too close to a radiator. Her jaw went completely slack. The elegant, polite smile slid off her face and shattered. Julian choked. He inhaled a sharp, wet breath, the champagne going down the wrong pipe, causing him to cough violently, his pristine tuxedo bowing forward. He stared at the screen, his shark-like eyes wide and unblinking, his brain violently rejecting the information his eyes and ears were receiving. Richard froze. He didn't move a single muscle. He stood completely paralyzed, his hand still resting in the air where he had been gesturing just moments before. "Maya," the journalist repeated on the broadcast, "you stepped away from a life in the suburbs of Connecticut to build an empire in the shadows. Why the secrecy? Why hide behind a pseudonym?" "Because," I replied smoothly on screen, not breaking eye contact with the lens, "the environment I was raised in did not view my art as a commodity of value. They viewed it as a stain, as an embarrassment. I needed to remove myself, my name, my gender, my familial ties from the equation entirely. I needed to prove that my work had intrinsic, undeniable power, separate from the people who told me I was worthless." A low, uncomfortable murmur began to ripple through the wealthy crowd in the Connecticut living room. Arthur Montgomery narrowed his eyes, looking from the screen to Richard, his expression hardening into suspicious confusion. "Let's talk about your newest piece." The journalist pivoted, her eyes alight with the thrill of the exclusive. "The piece that just sold at Sotheby's for a staggering $2 million. Genesis. Critics are calling it a masterpiece of raw, industrial emotion. What is the inspiration behind this incredibly violent, chaotic structure? This was it. The blade was drawn. I didn't just want to stab them. I wanted to twist the knife until the handle broke off. On the broadcast, a slow, terrifyingly cold smile spread across my face. The title Genesis was a placeholder, I explained, my voice velvet and venom. The true title of the piece is Clutter Reborn. 5 years ago, I was living at home. I had spent 3 years building a massive portfolio of work. I was preparing to submit it to galleries. One afternoon, my brother decided he wanted to build a home gym in the basement. So, without my permission, he hired a demolition crew. They took a sledgehammer to my life's work, smashed it to pieces, and threw it into a rusted green dumpster in our driveway while it poured rain. A collective gasp swept through the guests in the Connecticut living room. Several women covered their mouths in shock. Julian stumbled backward, bumping into a wealthy heiress, spilling the remnants of his champagne down her silk dress. He didn't even notice. He was staring at the bronze and crystal sculpture in the foyer with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He was looking at the exact shape of his own cruelty, immortalized in titanium. I left that night, my televised self continued softly, the emotional weight of the story hanging heavy in the studio air. My parents sided with my brother. They told me my art was worthless clutter. They told me to grow up. So I did. I leaned forward on the broadcast, staring through the camera, staring directly into the souls of the three monsters standing in their opulent living room. I recreated that dumpster fire, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a judge reading a death sentence. I used oxidized bronze, custom-cut optical crystal, and aerospace titanium to recreate the exact pile of garbage my family threw away. Every shattered canvas, every bent chain. A perfect one-to-one replica of my destroyed soul. The silence in the Connecticut house was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with impending doom. Why? The journalist asked, genuinely breathless. Because I knew my family, I smiled on screen. I knew their obsession with status. I knew my father, Richard, was desperately trying to impress a group of European investors to save his failing private equity firm. I knew my brother, Julian, had an ego so fragile he would mortgage his own apartment to win a bidding war at Sotheby's. I orchestrated the entire auction. I made sure they were invited. I knew they wouldn't recognize the piece, because they never bothered to look at my art when it was right in front of them. My father let out a sound. It wasn't a word, it was a guttural, wounded wheeze. His knees buckled slightly, and he grabbed the edge of the grand piano to keep from collapsing. Evelyn was shaking violently, her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes darting wildly around the room at her guests. I created it. I delivered the final, devastating blow on national television, to see if the people who called my life's work worthless garbage would take out high-interest loans, liquidate their retirement, and bankrupt their entire existence just to buy it back. And they did, for $2 million. The broadcast faded to black, transitioning to a commercial break. In my Tribeca penthouse, I picked up my glass of Cabernet and took a long, satisfying sip. In the Connecticut living room, all hell broke loose. It wasn't an explosion of anger, it was an implosion of social standing. The European investors Richard had spent the entire evening courting, exchanged disgusted, horrified glances. To them, cruelty might have been excusable, but being the victim of a globally publicized, multi-million-dollar humiliation was a stain that would never wash out. They didn't say a word. They simply turned in unison, grabbed their coats from the cloakroom, and walked out the front door, stepping right past the $2 million pile of trash. Arthur Montgomery let out a loud, barking laugh. It was a harsh, cruel sound. He looked at Richard, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at the unmitigated stupidity of it all. "You bought her trash, Richard," Arthur boomed, the words echoing off the high ceilings. "You leveraged your firm to buy a monument to your own idiocy. Good God, man, you are completely finished." Arthur motioned to his wife, and they too walked out. The exodus was swift and merciless. Within 10 minutes, the grand living room was empty. The catered hors d'oeuvres sat untouched on silver platters. The half-empty champagne flutes caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. The only people left in the house were the three of them. My father was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the leg of the grand piano, his head in his hands, rocking slightly back and forth. His firm was gone. The European bailout was dead. The margin loans were due, and the house was leveraged to the hilt. He was a ruined man. My mother was standing perfectly still in the center of the room, staring blankly at the wall, her mind simply refusing to process the cataclysmic destruction of her social universe. The architectural digest life she had curated so viciously was over. And Julian walked slowly into the foyer. He stood in front of Clutter Reborn. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold, bruised titanium chains. The realization washed over him, a physical weight that crashed down on his shoulders, bowing his spine. He had destroyed his sister to make room for a treadmill. In return, she had patiently, methodically, and brilliantly annihilated his entire future. He sank to his knees on the imported Italian marble, staring into the shattered prisms of crystal, finally seeing exactly what his arrogance had bought him. Elias reached forward and gently tapped the screen of the tablet, severing the connection. The massive monitor in my studio went dark, returning my sanctuary to a state of perfect, uninterrupted peace. "Well," Elias said softly, leaning back against the kitchen island, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "I believe that concludes our business with the syndicate. Shall I instruct the bank to reject any incoming calls from their numbers?" "Block them on every channel, Elias," I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering expanse of the city that now belonged to me. "Let them scream into the void." The aftermath over the next few months was a predictable, pathetic spiral. The news of the interview sent shockwaves through the financial and art sectors. My father's private equity firm suffered a catastrophic run. Investors pulled their capital en masse within 48 hours, citing a lack of judgment and stability at the executive level. The firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 weeks later. Julian's luxury Tribeca condo was foreclosed on by the bank. His pristine slate-gray Porsche was repossessed in the middle of the night. He was unhirable in the finance sector, a walking punchline known as the man who bankrupted himself to buy his sister's revenge. Last I heard through the whispers of the city, he was living in a cheap rental in New Jersey, working a mid-level accounting job he absolutely despised. And the house in Connecticut, the sterile beige fortress of my mother's pride, was seized by the creditors. They were forced to liquidate everything inside it at auction just to cover a fraction of the debt they had accrued. Everything, of course, except the sculpture. Sotheby's refused to buy it back. No gallery would touch it. It was too famous, too heavily stigmatized as a symbol of absolute foolishness. It had zero resale value to anyone else. It was exactly what I had designed it to be, a $2 million albatross tied permanently around their necks. They tried to contact me, naturally. The day after the broadcast, my gallery's switchboard was flooded with frantic, pleading voicemails from my father, begging for a loan, begging me to buy the piece back, begging for a sliver of mercy. My mother sent long, rambling emails to Elias, suddenly claiming she always knew I had a special gift and that she was a victim of Julian's temper. Julian himself left a single voicemail. He didn't apologize. He just sounded broken, hollow, and utterly defeated. I didn't listen to the voicemails a second time. I didn't read the emails. I didn't gloat, and I didn't engage. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. For 30 years, I had craved their validation. I had folded myself into the dark corners of their lives, hoping they would eventually see me. Now, they were on their knees, begging me to see them, and I simply didn't care to look. I turned away from the window of my penthouse and walked back to the center of my studio. The morning sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon, bleeding soft, golden light across the concrete floor. Resting on a heavy, iron easel was a massive, blank canvas. Beside it sat a fresh cart of oils, industrial resins, and raw pigments. My hands didn't shake, my chest didn't ache. I picked up a palette knife, dipped it into a rich, vibrant stroke of phthalo blue, and pressed it against the blinding white surface of the canvas. For the first time in my life, there was no clutter. There was only the beautiful, infinite silence of a blank wall, waiting for me to fill it. He walked out of the kitchen, whistling a tuneless melody. My parents immediately went back to their morning routines, completely unfazed by the fact that they had just casually ordered the execution of my soul. I didn't argue anymore. I knew better. Arguing with them was like screaming at a brick wall and expecting it to apologize. I stood up, dumped my uneaten oatmeal into the sink, and walked out the door to go to my shift at the gallery. The air outside was crisp, biting with the chill of late November. I got into my cold car, my hands trembling violently as I gripped the steering wheel. I told myself I would figure it out. I would rent a storage unit. I would take out a predatory payday loan if I had to. I would hire movers, carefully wrap the iron and resin sculpture in moving blankets, and get my portfolio out of that house before the weekend. I just needed a few days. I just needed 48 hours to figure out the logistics. They told me I had until the weekend. Today was Thursday. I had time. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief, putting the car in drive and pulling out of the driveway, completely unaware that Julian had already measured the stairwell.